Hello, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Meriwether and Tharp. We are very busy on the program today. I want to follow up. I always like to do the follow-up. I always feel like I don't have any papers to pop today, but I always feel like a newsman when I follow up on a story we covered yesterday. We have new details, developing situations. We'll do all that here coming up in just a little bit. I'm excited about that. Actually, it is kind of interesting to sort of see the furtherance of a theme that we've addressed a few times here in terms of, boy, I guess Georgia's just going to be lucky to win any games here in 2023 because it seems like, once again, a lot of folks want to pour out these dogs. We'll give you the latest and let you decide what you think of all of that. Also, I've been thinking a little bit about what I believe Georgia's top strength to be for the upcoming season. I think this is an important thing to consider. So we'll do a little bit of that today. A special guest appearance today by Connor Riley. Normally it's Terrence Edwards on a Thursday. Terrence is busy working on his day job today. Had some stuff going on there with that. So we'll let Terrence be pinch hit for by our good friend Connor Riley. Connor's about to go on some vacation for a while. So while we've already heard from Connor once this week, this will be our last time to hear from Connor for quite some time. So we will do that here in just a little bit there as well. And don't forget, former Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm going to join us tomorrow. So we got a lot of moving pieces. We're moving the chess pieces around on the board here a little bit. But our goal, our duty, our solemn vow is to entertain you here and have some good fun talking some Georgia football. So what do you say we get it going today on a Thursday? It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. It's presented by Meriwether and Tharp, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Meriwether and Tharp, your source for Georgia divorce. Find them online at theatlantadivorceteam.com.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
You know, as the summer rolls on, there are these I guess sort of tentpole benchmarks that you kind of go across as you kind of get towards the start of the upcoming season. That's how we mark time towards the, kind of off season into the start of the season. We talk about a lot of these from time to time when the preseason magazines start coming out and some of the various online pieces that are always written that kind of let you know that, okay, that's one more thing we've kind of gotten past on our way to the start of the season. And coming up here in a couple of weeks, what is it, the 17th of the 20th of July, something like that, in Nashville this year, one of the things that's going to take place is SEC Media Days. That's one of those things that's probably more important to media than it is to fans, I would guess. But nonetheless, that's one of those deals where you're really getting close to the start of the season. And you're kind of really in the season form, only a couple of weeks prior to the start of practices and everything else. Once you kind of get to that point on the calendar, you're sort of there and sort of, ready to go for that upcoming year. And one of the things we're talking about yesterday during our R.S. Andrews cool down time, and for those of you that listen to the podcast or maybe don't get a chance to watch the full video, at the very end of our show every day, we have a thing called the R.S. Andrews cool down. R.S. Andrews, one of our great sponsors, and one of the things they do for us is provide us a little extra time there at the end of the show. We read comments and live commentary, things like that. We like to be the most interactive show on the broadcast airwaves. We feel like we do a pretty good job of that, and that's one of the things that we do. And one of the things that had come up yesterday was the idea of, well, who Georgia might take with it to SEC Media Days. And I think there's a handful of players that Georgia certainly could take. One of the guys I assume that Georgia will probably take is Cedric Von Prawn-Granger. I think Cedric Von Prawn coming back here for this particular season, I think ends up being one of the biggest boost that Georgia's got for the entirety of the offseason. And listen, by the time you get to September and the season kicks off, boy, a lot has happened over the previous 9 months, right? And it can be easy to forget just how important some storylines turned out to be. I think there was an example of that in 2021 when Georgia won the first of what turned out to be 2 straight national championships with maybe more on the way. That particular year, you may remember very early in the year, Dan Lanning had overtures of going and being a part of Steve Sarkisian's first staff at Texas. This is back when Lanning was still Georgia defensive coordinator prior to becoming Oregon head coach. He had big offer. We were led to believe maybe big money to go work at Texas, and Lanning turned that down, chose to stay at Georgia, even though going to work for an offensive-minded head coach could have allowed him to get out of Kirby Smart's spotlight, and maybe Lanning could have thought that could have furthered his career. It certainly could have made him a little bit richer at the time, but Lanning chose not to do that. And what we said was, hey, don't forget this. When it gets time for the start of the season, when Georgia gets ready to play in 2021, don't forget how monumental, how pivotal it was that Georgia back in 2021 was able to hold on to Dan Lanning, keep him as defensive coordinator. We thought that was just a very important building block to the season to come, and as it turns out, it was part of a recipe for a national championship. This year's version of that, going into this upcoming season and the mission to go for 3-23, the decision of Cedric Von Prawn-Granger, who could have gone on to the NFL and likely would have been a pretty, coveted draft pick there as a very good center. That, I think, position has grown in importance in the NFL circles within the last couple of years. We think that Van Prawn would have had a lot of draft prospects coming his way, and yet ultimately chose to come back to Georgia for one final season. And in doing so, I think once again becomes one of those very important building blocks. In an offseason of all kinds of transfer additions and recruiting news and this and that, and all the stuff that's going on, Van Prawn's decision to return to the team is just, I think, a very big deal. So much so that as I was thinking about, kind of Van Prawn and maybe being in SEC media days, what he might be doing, and all of that, it leads me to say this. And this is one of those things where I think reasonable people can have various opinions, right? The question I kind of posed to myself and asked myself was, hey, what is Georgia's ultimate strength this upcoming year? Of all the position groups, and clearly, Georgia's had the best defense, and, Georgia's taking huge strides on offense, and really, Georgia came, I think, very close a year ago, just being the best across the board. Of all the things that Georgia has done, really well, all the different levels of success that it's had, for the upcoming season, if you had to hang your hat on one thing, one position group, one idea that gives Georgia its ultimate edge towards going for its third straight national championship. Once again, I think you kind of circle back to the idea that Cedric Von Prawn returns, that Amarius Mims emerges as a full season starter. Someone like Ernest Green may be emerging opposite him as a starter at offensive tackle. Veteran guards like a Tate Ratledge or Xavier Truss. All of a sudden you are looking at a Georgia offensive line, I believe, that isn't just the best in the country, something I think that's probably been true the last 2 years. It's not just the best in the country, but it actually may be the best overall unit anywhere for Georgia this year. And weirdly, it's that last part that may be the actual overall best compliment. That there are a lot of Georgia position groups the last couple of years that may have been best in the country, but vying to be the best position group on your own roster, that actually may be the toughest task for any kind of Georgia team, Georgia situation right now. And if you told me, BA, what is your best Georgia position group? Compare the Georgia offensive line to the Georgia defensive line, to the Georgia offensive line, to the Georgia linebackers, or the Georgia secondary, to the Georgia, wide receiver situation, whatever else. Start comparing these position groups across both sides of the ball and everything else. I believe if I had to hang my hat on one thing, I believe I'd hang my hat on the Georgia offensive line this year. I believe as long as guys stay healthy and as long as things kind of play out the way that it's supposed to, I believe I'd hang my hat on that Georgia offensive line this year as the very best position group on this particular roster. And let me also say this. I think when the stories are told of how Georgia has won its last two national championships, I think not enough attention is paid over the course of time to the fact that the Georgia offensive line has led the way in this as much as it possibly has. I still think the performance of Georgia offensive lines that include the likes of Broderick Jones, this year, and go back to a year ago in 2021, the likes of Jamari Salyer and some of the guys that were there a part of that. I still think in terms of all the credit that's doled out for who helped contribute to these national championships, I still think overall the Georgia offensive line has probably not gotten the credit that it's probably deserved. Sometimes for the national folks for sure, maybe even UGA fans there as well. And it's kind of funny, going into last season, that seemed to be a little bit of a motivating force for the Georgia offensive line. There is an award given out. It's called the Joe Moore Award. It's kind of a cool trophy because it's like 5 offensive linemen stretched out, and it's sort of a cool trophy. Georgia has been, I guess, runner-up for this award the last couple of years, but after the 2021 season, Georgia really set its sights on trying to win that award for the 2022 season. And one of the reasons why I think Van Prawn coming back here for 2023 is so valuable is because of the leadership that he has shown in terms of really marshaling the forces for Georgia there in that group and really kind of setting sights on what the ultimate goal really is. And, you want to go back to 2 springs ago prior to the 2022 season, spring practice of 2022, Van Pran spoke up clearly, articulately about how much he wanted his offensive line unit to be represented and recognized as the best in the entire country. What Van Pran said more than a year ago, just as relevant right now. This is a reminder of just how valuable Van Pran's leadership returning for Georgia can be here this year.
I'll say this. We definitely want to honor the guys that came last year, but honestly, this is a new group, and we feel slighted because let me rephrase that. Not slighted. Slighted is the right word. We just want to use it as motivation that we didn't win the Joe Moore last year, so we want to be the best group possible.
I mean, what a clear, concise message. We want to be recognized as the Joe Moore Award winners. That's the award that goes to the nation's best offensive line. We want to be viewed as the best offensive line possible. Now, what's funny about that is that Georgia in 2022 came up short again, and I say that in air quotes because once again Michigan was honored as the best offensive. They won the thing 2 years in a row. I guess it's only possible for Michigan to win the offensive line award, the Joe Moore Award. No matter what Georgia does, they don't seem to be able to impress the Joe Moore Award folks enough to be able to do that. By the way, more on Michigan here in a moment. There are new details in the story we talked about yesterday of the comparisons between Michigan and Georgia. We'll get to that here coming up in just a moment. But the idea that Van Pran said, hey, we want to win the Joe Moore Award. We want to be recognized the best offensive line. In 2021, they thought the Michigan offensive line was better, despite the fact that on both sides of the ball, Georgia just shoved Michigan all over the place in the Orange Bowl. We want to be recognized as the best offensive line this year. You gave it to Michigan in 2021. We want you to give it to us in 2022. But once again, somehow Michigan won the award in 2022. So my guess is if Van Pran were sitting here right now, he would say very, very clearly, just as concisely and unmistakably clear as he was prior to the 2022 season, he'd be that way again. That, hey, coming up short slightly again in 2022 only makes us more motivated want to come out and win that award here in 2023. But one more point here on the Georgia offensive line for a moment. So if you were to and as you're listening to this, you may say, well, BA, I actually don't think the offensive line is the best strength. I think it's maybe this whatever thing. You could make a different case for different position. I'm certainly not going to deny that. Of course, that's true. But would you be willing to, for the sake of conversation just for a moment, would you be willing to kind of just go along with me that the Georgia offensive line is kind of the main catalyst that's going to propel this offense this season, the main catalyst that might propel Georgia again towards a third straight national championship? Think about how true that is, how remarkable that is for a moment, at least in one respect. When Kirby Smart came to Georgia in 2016 to sort of begin his head coaching career, I think we're led to believe that one of the things that Smart thought was most important about starting that time at Georgia, starting his head coaching career, one of the main, foundational pieces he wanted to have in place as he began his time as a head coach is he's wanted Sam Pittman as offensive line coach. And Pittman was so valuable here at Georgia in 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, and then became Arkansas head coach. I think that was a surprise to even Pittman that he was tabbed for that job there at that particular time. I think he thought he might be a lifer offensive line coach, and I think a lot of Georgia fans were hoping he'd be the guy that was sort of the lifer position coach here at UGA, the same way that Dell McGee's just sort of always been here. I think a lot of Georgia fans were sort of hoping that Sam Pittman might be the version of that on the offensive line there as well. Incredibly popular guy, incredibly important part of the early success that Kirby Smart had. Then, boom, one day, he's gone. He's a head coach in the SEC, and obviously Georgia fans still sort of cheer for Arkansas now for the most part because of their love affair with Pittman while he was here. And yet in his absence, the Georgia offensive line for the most part really hasn't kind of skipped a beat. Matt Luke stepped in, former SEC head coach, helped Georgia win some very important recruiting battles and helped Georgia kind of maintain a level of success. And then when he decided he wanted to step away from coaching, Stacey Searles stepped in. And listen, I don't mind telling you, when Searles was first hired here to return to Georgia after having been here before, that was a little bit of an eyebrow-raising decision for some of us. Really? Georgia's going back to its past here on Searles? Georgia's kind of going back in time, bringing in a guy like this. Is this really the right move? Is this really the guy that we're sure that Kirby Smart ought to be tabbing here? It didn't feel like the Sam Pittman days to a lot of folks. The confidence a lot of Georgia fans had in Pittman, the Stacey Searles part of this, didn't quite feel that way prior to last season. But the one thing we love about sports is that the scoreboard rules over everything. And whatever our preconceived notions might be, whatever our priorly held opinions might be, what we see happen on the field ultimately ought to change our mind about anything when new information is given, when new results are able to be observed. Then we ought to change our opinion to make sure we get it right and make sure that the scoreboard tells us what actually happened. And so for a lot of Georgia fans, I think they were left to conclude, well, actually, Stacey Searels may be a better fit here for Georgia, a better contributor to Georgia's championship success than maybe some of us thought he was going to be capable of being. He had that kind of year for Georgia a year ago. And as Georgia looks to have great offensive line success again this year, once again, it's a guy like Searels who wasn't necessarily a lot of fans' top pick to get the job when Matt Luke stepped away, but it's Stacey Searels who's going to be tabbed to kind of help keep that in place. And once again, to go back in time to when Searels was first hired, a little bit more than a year ago now, a guy like Cedric Von Braun, who has a very analytical approach to all of this, he told you then that he thought that Searels was going to be a good fit for Georgia and certainly one of those guys that was going to allow the offensive line to kind of bond together and bond around him. Let's go back in time again to hear Van Braun, this time on Stacey Searels, a guy who I think has made a pretty good name for himself over the course of the last year. Here's Van Braun again.
Oh, absolutely love him. Very technical guy, really smart football-wise, understands schemes. A little bit different terminology because he's coming from a different school, but football is football.
Yeah, so Van Braun told you then, if you're a Georgia fan, you got nothing to be worried about. Stacey Searels, I like this guy. And Senator Van Braun could have said, he didn't say this, but he could have said, hey, I know good offensive line play because I am a good offensive lineman, and I feel very comfortable with Stacey Searels. And I think now all Georgia fans do there as well. So here's the bottom line, is that we know what the storyline of the upcoming season is going to be. It's going to be a go for 3 and 23 type campaign for the Dogs. We've already predicted it to happen. We believe that's going to be the case. But how will Georgia get there? That's always the fun kind of mystery to unravel, the mystery to solve. And for us, we think on a pretty strong roster with deep, successful position groups for the most part across the board, there may be none better than the Georgia offensive line. And given the way the offensive line has propelled Georgia the last 2 years, that could end up being a very good thing. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Meriwether and Tharp. And we are happy to be with you here today, live on video, 10 a.m., Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, on the radio at noon, on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref. We start even earlier, by the way, on video, 9:45, our first and 15, DawgNation.com, DawgNation app. I love taking those live comments, love interacting with our folks on a daily basis, just something that I really, really enjoy. I also am very proud of the folks who tune in and join us on podcast every day, whether it's the Apple player, the Spotify player, world-famous DawgNation.com. However you get with us today, we are just really happy to have you here. And we are so thankful to our friends at Meriwether and Tharp who make it all possible. And Meriwether and Tharp is your source for Georgia divorce. And listen, I know listen, divorce is just a tough, heavy thing. I realize that. We like to have fun around here, especially during the summertime. We're relaxed. We're just kind of enjoying thinking about a fun 4th of July weekend kind of coming up here and all the kind of cool stuff that goes along with that. And, I don't want to grind the show to a halt talking about the divorce process, but here's what I also know. For some of you, this is real. For some of you, it has either happened or it is happening. You fear it might happen. And I got to talk directly to you here for a moment because while I'd love to sort of wave a magic wand and pretend none of that stuff is there, and none of that stuff is a reality that must be confronted, deep down, that's just not the case. So sometimes sort of facing this kind of stuff head on is just the thing that has to happen. And that's why I have no hesitation at all about speaking very loudly and very clearly about my friends at Meriwether and Tharp and the work they can do for you in what might end up being the most challenging scenario you ever face in your adult life. I just know what they have done for thousands and thousands of people before, and I truly believe they can do the same thing for you, which is provide you a pathway towards a successful, satisfactory outcome where you say, hey, I may not have a lot of, great feelings about the past, or at least there may be some parts of this, sort of my past here that I'm not, super thrilled with, but I feel very confident about how well I am set up for the future. And folks, a lot of times that's just what it is all about. That having a plan for getting through this divorce process and having a plan for what your life's going to look like after that, sometimes that's the best gift that you can give yourself. So start this process by just educating yourself. Go to the website, theatlantadivorceteam.com, theatlantadivorceteam.com. Learn about this through the free resources that our friends at Meriwether and Tharp, they provide, the blog posts, the podcasts, the things like that. I think it gives you a way of kind of learning how to ask better questions when maybe you have that first free initial consultation with one of those Meriwether and Tharp attorneys. Then after that, I think you'll see that the right thing for you to do is to hire Meriwether and Tharp to help you walk through this divorce process. So please find them online, theatlantadivorceteam.com, theatlantadivorceteam.com. Meriwether and Tharp is your source for Georgia divorce. All right, so today is a Thursday. Oftentimes that means Terrence Edwards, the great former Georgia wide receiver, and it will mean Terrence Edwards again, but not this week. Terrence is predisposed. His day job came calling for him today, so we're going to have a pinch hit appearance by Connor Riley. Now, we've already had Connor on the show once this week, but we've got some fun stuff to talk about him with today, and Connor's about to be on vacation now for a few days. He's going to enjoy some of that, much the same way I did last weekend. So this will be our last chance to talk to Connor for a little while, so we will look forward to doing that here in just a little bit. Prior to that, though, I want to go around the DawgHouse. And, y'all, I got bad news, and I hate this because a lot of Georgia fans that, man, they look forward to the season. They've won the last 2 national championships. A lot of Georgia fans, I think, were of the belief that maybe Georgia had a really good chance to, as we say around here, go for 3-23. But it just sort of seems like, once again, some of these, experts, if you will, national writers, we heard from Kirk Herbstreit, they just don't seem to think Georgia's going to win the national championship. And, y'all, these people are never wrong about anything, I say sarcastically. So I guess you'll have to hope for 2024. Hope that's better, because 2023, apparently we're being led to believe that it's just not going to be Georgia, because it may be Alabama or it may be LSU. I guess there's somebody out there kind of touting LSU, even in comparison to Georgia here right now. And I guess these Michigan Wolverines, I guess they're one to be worried about here, there as well. The team, by the way, that's beaten Georgia out for the Joe Moore Award the last 2 years. Maybe this is the year they actually beat them on the field as well. We talked yesterday about the idea that Jim Harbaugh and Michigan are going to do a period of practice this year called their Beat Georgia period. We told you yesterday, I actually don't think that Georgia fans ought to be too bothered by that, and I'll kind of give you another explanation of kind of why that's true here in a moment. But the guy who revealed that to us is a guy named Bruce Feldman. He is a national writer for a website called The Athletic, and he was on an NFL Network, NFL.com podcast, and he's the one that revealed that. But I've also been made aware of some other information that Feldman shared on this podcast, his opinion of Michigan here this year. Now, I'd play the audio for it. I'll be honest, I have a little bit of a computer issue this week, so the audio is a little shaky here this week. I'm talking about the audio clips that we play, a little shaky here this week. I'm going to read this to you as a quote instead. Bruce Feldman from The Athletic, on with Bucky Brooks and Daniel Jeremiah. Jeremiah I really like. He's on this podcast with them. And, man, Feldman is just talking up Michigan here this year. And if you're a Georgia fan, gosh, you've already heard you're not as good as Alabama. Somebody's out there trying to say you're not as good as LSU. And all of a sudden now, I don't know what happened to Georgia 2 years ago. They were dominating Michigan, but now they'll just be lucky to even stay in the game with the Wolverines, I guess, based on Bruce Feldman here for a moment. Let me read this quote to you. This from the NFL podcast he was on the other day. Feldman saying of Michigan, they have a bunch of those guys who decided to come back as opposed to leaving early for the NFL. A lot of those guys were the real team leaders, and they're almost all back. To me, they not only should be a playoff team, I think if J.J. McCarthy, the quarterback, can take the next step, and look, he's going to need a little help from the receivers. He says, listen to this. Bruce Feldman says, I don't want to say they're the odds-on favorite, but is this really what we're doing now? Because, by the way, it was Reese Davis. We told you, a few times this summer. He was on a podcast. He got Michigan as his number one team. Now Bruce Feldman is flirting with the idea of saying Michigan is the odds-on favorite. He says, this is the most talented team they've ever had. Bruce Feldman on with Daniel Jeremiah and Bucky Brooks, NFL Network. He goes on to say, let me read the rest of this quote to you. He says, you got to get through the SEC to win a national title, right? He says they're arch right. Now listen to this. Y'all, I'm mostly doing this for fun. None of this stuff matters. I do get this. But what I'm about to read to you, this crawls all over me. I don't take any of this personally. I think it's all just for fun. We're college football fans. We like kind of going back and forth and arguing with each other. But the level of logic that you have to twist yourself into a knot into in order to be able to make this with a straight face It literally is baffling. He says, so first of all, as I said to you, he says you got to go through the SEC to win the national title. I love the fact that it's just the generic SEC and not the two-time national champion Georgia Bulldogs, the team that literally kicked out Michigan's teeth in Miami 2 years ago. It's just the SEC. Maybe it's LSU, maybe it's Alabama, maybe I guess it could be Georgia, the team that's won 29 of its last 30 games, 33 of its last 34. I guess maybe it could be Georgia, but it's just the generic SEC for right now. But that's not the worst part of this. Feldman goes on to say, their arch rival, meaning Ohio State, who they whipped at their own place. They were this close to winning that game against the Georgia Bulldogs and knocking the Bulldogs out of the mix. And I think this Michigan team is more talented than, the one that they just had. Actually, I think it's considerably more talented. Bruce Feldman on with Bucky Brooks and Daniel Jeremiah making a big case for Michigan winning this year's national title. And in doing so, and he's not the only one that's done this, and this kind of bothers me a little bit. In doing so, he's not the only one who seems to want to give Ohio State more credit for keeping it close against Georgia than Georgia gets for winning the game. The amount of illogical delusion that you have to wrap yourself into in order to make that argument with a straight face, as I said before, it is truly mind-boggling. Because let me remind you of what was said about Georgia prior to that particular game against Ohio State last year, and for 2 years prior to that, if not more than that. Remember what used to be said about Georgia? Georgia may have the best defense in the country, but what happens if they get into a shootout? Can this Georgia team win in a shootout? Are they built to be able to do that? Sure, they're able to win when the game is played at the pace they want it played at. Sure, they're able to win if things are exactly the way they want them to be. Defense, line of scrimmage. If the game goes that way, we know Georgia's good. But what happens if a team gets them into a shootout? Does this team have the offensive firepower to win a shootout? Then lo and behold, Georgia goes out and wins the shootout-style game against a shootout-style team, and it's Ohio State that still gets the most credit for that. Ohio State kept it close against Georgia. Not only does that mean that Ohio State's great, it means that it means that Michigan's great. Well, Georgia won the game. Does it mean they're great? No, we're not worried about Georgia right now. This is about Michigan. Ohio State losing to Georgia proves how good Michigan is somehow. This is the stuff that we do this time of year, and it's mostly just in fun, and I'm kind of laughing as I say this. But you think cable news politics arguments are dumb? This is a special kind of dumb, I believe. I don't think that Bruce Feldman's dumb. I'm sure he went to some fancy college or something like that. I'm not saying he's dumb. I'm saying this is a pretty dumb argument, and he's not the only one that makes this kind of stuff on a very, very regular basis, which is ultimately why we weren't really mad at Michigan for doing their, quote, beat Georgia practice period, which Feldman told us they're going to do. We're not mad about that because, honestly, to Michigan's credit, they seem to be the only ones who are actually giving Georgia their just due. Feldman's got the generic SEC, not the whole league, not the two-time national champion, but the whole league as the stumbling block for this vaunted Michigan team, and it's marched towards the national championship as if this was still 1962. He's just got the generic SEC standing in the way. But Michigan, to its credit, Jim Harbaugh, you can say what you want. He may be dumb, but he ain't stupid. At least he knows that the actual stumbling block here is not the SEC and the generic placeholder champion from that league. It is specifically the Georgia Bulldogs. And to take it a step further here, J.J. McCarthy, who I honestly believe legitimately is a good player. And listen, I think Michigan legitimately is probably a pretty good team. But J.J. McCarthy, to his credit, he was interviewed by ESPN the other day talking about, a whole bunch of stuff. And, to me, it's McCarthy having been on the field with Georgia who seems to be about the only one, or at least among the very few, who are actually sort of acknowledging just how large the gap is between Georgia and everybody else. So, McCarthy was talking about the question posed to McCarthy, the Michigan quarterback, was something to the effect of, coming up short in the playoffs the last couple of years. And the point that JJ was making in the piece is actually the TCU loss that hurt him more than the Georgia loss did. And I want to read this to you because this is an example of what I think is the correct appraisal of sort of Georgia's situation here, where guys like Bruce Feldman and Kirk Herbstreit and Reese Davis have kind of all gotten it wrong. Let me show you JJ McCarthy here. This is from ESPN.com. He says the TCU loss definitely hurt a lot more than losing to Georgia. He says, when I went in as a freshman, we were playing what he calls the defense of the decade. This to me is a little bit more appropriate. J.J. McCarthy is like, hey, it hurt to lose to TCU. When I went against Georgia, that was the defense of the decade. He says, it was kind of like, all right, let's see what I can do out here. He says, then realistic expectations set in like, ooh, this is going to be tough. That's totally appropriate. J.J. McCarthy says, hey, I had a chance to play against Georgia. Let me go out and try my hand here against these dogs. Whoops, this ain't going to be fun. This is going to be tough. This is the defense of the decade. That's why I would say Michigan's doing a beat Georgia period. Because Georgia has been so good, Michigan on the field with Georgia realized there was a chasm. I mean, the fathoms of difference between what Georgia was and what Michigan was. And so therefore, Michigan is using Georgia by name to identify the absolute measuring stick. Kirk Herbstreit's still living in the past, recent past, looking at Alabama. Guys like Bruce Feldman are living in the distant past, as if Bo Schembechler was still, patrolling the sidelines, going back to like the 1960s with the idea of Michigan winning a national championship here right now. It's the actual Wolverines themselves who seem to realize, you know what? Georgia's running this thing at the moment. Georgia is the boss of this entire sport here right now. So I don't think Michigan's win the national championship. In fact, I didn't even pick them to make the playoff when I made my official predictions the other day. But at least they get it right in terms of who actually is on top. And as they aspire to themselves for greatness, at least they are identifying what greatness actually is. So a little bit of a soapbox. I didn't quite mean to go on such a soapbox about that, but I do think some of this kind of stuff is pretty ridiculous all the way around. All right, speaking of boastful claims, before our show is done, by the way, that is around the DawgHouse here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether and Tharp today. And speaking of boastful claims, before our show is done today, we're going to hear another boastful claim from someone in the SEC. And actually, I think this is kind of interesting. I think it sets up a pretty interesting debate. And I don't know that the guy who says this is necessarily wrong about what he says, but I do think it provides an interesting comparison, which actually brings Georgia back into the conversation. But I believe this is also really bad news for what has kind of been Georgia's top arch nemesis, not biggest rival, but top arch nemesis over the course of recent years. What is all this about? I will explain that to you coming up in just a moment. But for now, normally on a Thursday, it's Terrence Edwards, the great former Georgia wide receiver, who's always so good to be with us and talk to us about all the things kind of going on with Georgia football from his perspective as a former player, and we will definitely look forward to getting back to doing that again very soon. But for this particular week, we had to call in a pinch hitter. When you have a chance to call in a pinch hitter, no better person to do that with than Connor Riley. And we're going to get into a lot of stuff with Connor here coming up in just a moment, including some of the stuff that's out there about Michigan right now and kind of the fun of all the people who kind of once again seem to be doubting Georgia here just a little bit. We're going to do all of that over the course of the next few minutes, and that is going to be a lot of fun. Connor Riley here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether and Tharp today. All right, so that is what's coming up. We're going to effort to get Connor on the phone here. We got, as I said before, kind of move some pieces around here, so we'll get Connor here coming up in just a little bit. And yesterday we had, kind of a similar issue. Had a tap dance there for a moment, and so as we tap dance here today, we'll may take some of your live comments live on the air. We did that a little bit yesterday. That was really fun, and we'll do some of that here today there as well. Once again, that will be very fun. And so it's a summertime type situation here. We're sort of relaxed, and we'll kind of be a little bit relaxed. And honestly, I'd be kind of curious to hear, from you, if, how much you might kind of, I guess agree with what we were saying there about those who are touting teams other than Georgia to win this year's national championship. You can kind of weigh in on that if you want to. Let us see going on here. Randy Glass, by the way, chicken at DawgNation.com, says Michigan is no threat to UGA. Media just wants these large fan bases to believe they have a chance to beat Georgia for more fan engagement. I believe that Randy is probably almost 100% right about that. I really do. That this is one of those things that if you kind of don't spend a lot of time around college football media or you don't work in media, you might not fully understand and appreciate this. But these like really big Big Ten fan bases are huge, and the Michigan fan base may be as big as any. Michigan's one of the 3 or 4 or 5 most popular teams in all of college football. So it is always good business to tout Michigan for the national championship. It just is. Always good business to do that. Always good business to sort of talk them up. Notre Dame would be the same way, and Ohio State would be the same way. USC to a certain extent kind of the same way, although there's just a little bit less passion far out west than there is in the Midwest and down here in the South. But these really big fan bases, that's just the case. So sometimes when you kind of wonder, well, why is so-and-so getting a lot of love, or why is so-and-so getting talked up? If you trace it back, oftentimes you'll find, it's one of these fan bases from a big populous state with a big populous alumni base, millions and millions of people, at least a couple of million people that deeply care about them. It's the same thing if you watch like the Shout Fest on ESPN, Fox, FS1. Who is it that Skip Bayless and Stephen A. Smith are always sort of yelling and shouting about? It's always the Dallas Cowboys. It's always LeBron James and the LA Lakers. It's always all of that. That's just sort of what they do. Just kind of the way that goes. Well, the college football version of that is Michigan, Ohio State. Georgia's one of those teams, too. I mean, if Georgia were 9-3, there'd be people, talking about, it could be Georgia's year there as well, because Georgia is a very big fan base in its own right. But in addition to the point that Randy's making there about, hey, you got to talk up Michigan, you got to talk up these Big Ten teams because they have in some cases very big fan bases. I think there's also this attempt to have a little bit of an intentional intellectual disconnect about the actual state of affairs in college football. That for those of us who are just sort of watching this and observing what we see with our own eyes, we see a huge gap between the performance on the field of the SEC teams and the performance on the field of the Big Ten teams. Yes, Georgia, Ohio State was close, and that's one of the reasons why people keep sort of grasping at that in terms of what that might mean for the upcoming season, because oftentimes when the SEC team has played the Big Ten team, such as Georgia, Michigan in the Orange Bowl the year before that, or Alabama against SEC team, or I should say Big Ten teams any number of times, hasn't quite been so close. So not only is there an attempt to sort of talk up some of these big fan base Big Ten teams, but some of that also requires ignoring just how successful on the field many of these SEC teams have been over the years. So I think Randy brings up a pretty good point on all of that. Now, to kind of keep this conversation going, kind enough to join us here on a day that's not really his typical day to join us here for DawgNation Daily. And it's always a conversation I look forward to, especially given the fact that Connor's going to be gone for a few days after this. So let's keep all of this going with Connor Riley from DawgNation. Always writing great stuff, including today there as well, too. Great piece on Glenn Shue and the inside linebackers. All of that up for grabs for us here right now, here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether and Tharp.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
So I'm so happy to have Connor Riley here today. We talked to him earlier this week, but it's always fun to be able to do that on a day like this there as well. Our buddy Terrence Edwards not able to join us, and Connor kind enough to be a part of our conversation here today. Connor, we don't often go to the bench for a pinch hitter, but when we do, we're happy to have a guy who brings some pop with the bat here off the bench. So we certainly appreciate that.
Yeah, hey, look, I'm just trying to get on base, but I'm glad I can help out in any way, shape, or form.
So I don't know, the other day I don't think we talked about some of the beat Georgia stuff that's out there from Michigan. I'm not really quite so sure, how much you've kind of paid attention to some of this, but prior to you joining us on the show today, one of the things we're talking about is the fact that Bruce Feldman, vaunted national writer, guy who's had a big platform for a long time, not only was he the one that kind of educates us to the fact that Michigan will have the beat Georgia period during practice this year, something I've said I have no problem with whatsoever. To me, it seems like just respect for a team like Georgia and for an aspirational goal. Obviously, you'd want to try to be as good as the best if you could be. But Feldman also goes on to sort of talk about the fact that he thinks, oh, my gosh, this Michigan team can win the national championship. And he kind of joins a guy like Reese Davis, who said that he thinks that Michigan may be his number one team there as well. And all of this just sort of feels very similar to some of the stuff we've heard, last year there as well, where it just seems like a lot of media types are shopping for someone, and in some cases anyone, other than Georgia win the national title. I'm not really mad about it. I think it's mostly fun. But in terms of the sort of sports arguments, college football arguments in particular we like having this time of year, I think some of the intellectual knots these folks tie themselves into to make this case, I think it stretches the imagination just a little bit. You're more objective than I am, so how do you feel about all of that?
So I'll take you a little inside baseball here. I think the big thing that some of these people are trying to do is they're trying to look smart. And I did the same thing a year ago, in sort of saying before the season, hey, I think Georgia's going to win another national championship, and then they kind of went out and did that. And so I think the thing that with this Michigan team, if I had to put a number 2 team in the country right now, I would pick them. I like what they bring back. J.J. McCarthy, I think, is a really good quarterback and a guy capable of winning. And I think you and I sort of see, I get the point you're making about how people are just not wanting to pick Georgia because they're not the flashy pick. I will say, I think with this Michigan team, one, they have this skill talent there, and I think, while their offensive line has been outplayed when they went against Georgia, I do think that there's something to this team where, they've gotten to the playoffs 2 straight years. They've beaten Ohio State, the big team in their conference, rather handily, and that was a team that Georgia struggled with a season ago, and I think that's a fair point. But I think the larger point that I have with this is that Jim Harbaugh at least recognizes that Georgia's the number 1 team in the country, and yes, you have to gear up and try and be your best, and Kirby Smart certainly subscribes to that theory. But Michigan sees Georgia as the top dog, and I think that should say a lot more about the direction of this Georgia program than who some media yahoos are picking to win this thing. I think Jim Harbaugh, as weird as he might be, is a guy who knows football pretty well, and that he views Georgia that highly, I think, says a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I said this yesterday too, but the whole beat Georgia thing is, if you're a Georgia fan, this is what I've been saying people should be doing this offseason. Like, if you want to make the case for Michigan, I like college football conversations. I'll have that with you. You want to make the case even for Ohio State, I'll do that with you. Alabama, LSU, I'm fine with that there as well. But it's appropriate to me to acknowledge Georgia first, much like the analogy I used, back in the early 2000s. If you wanted to pick Phil Mickelson win the U.S. Open, you better start by explaining why Tiger Woods isn't going to win. Or if you wanted to pick, Utah Jazz win the NBA title back in the late 90s, you better explain first to me why Michael Jordan isn't going to win. I think because Georgia has won 2 straight titles in the playoff era, something that no one else has done. We've seen multiple champs, but not in the back-to-back years. If you want to make the case for someone else, Alabama, Ohio State, Michigan, LSU, whoever else, I'm fine with that because that's what we do this time of year. We make fun arguments. We try to be somewhat contrarian when we can be. But you got to start the discussion by explaining why Georgia isn't going to win. You've got to acknowledge Georgia first. And to me, the beat Georgia period for the Michigan practice is the kind of acknowledgement of Georgia that I do think is appropriate. I don't mind the aspirational goal of, hey, we do want to be as good as Georgia. At least they're acknowledging Georgia, and that's the thing I think some people this offseason have sort of failed to do.
And I would agree with that. I was maybe a little bit too young to be breaking down Jazz Bulls in the late 90s. But there was a time, more recently, like with the Golden State Warriors, where they had to explain, okay, why was somebody going to beat a team that had Steph Curry and Kevin Durant? And again, it's kind of where we are in the offseason cycle, and you and I both know that no one really wants to have these super long, nuanced conversations about, why Georgia won't win a national title this year. But I think you and I cover this team as well as anybody knows the ins and outs of it. If the Georgia team doesn't win, maybe they lose to Tennessee, and even that feels weird to say out loud. But then, like a one-loss non-SEC champion Georgia with their schedule, is that going to be enough to get them in? Maybe, maybe not. From a game standpoint, maybe the quarterback and offense does take a step back. So I'd be, again, surprised if that happens. But the team just doesn't have a lot of holes. And while there isn't a whole lot of obvious stars outside of Brock Bowers, I find it hard to see that a team is going to beat Georgia with the schedule that they're playing, and that's just quite frankly not all that fun to talk about. I think Georgia won't have a real test, in my opinion, until that SEC championship game, and I think a big reason for that is just you go back and look at the way Georgia has played Tennessee, and really even Josh Heupel going back to when he was Missouri's offensive coordinator. Heupel just has not been able to figure out Kirby Smart in this defense, and while yes, Tennessee is getting more talent, Joe Milton started at Michigan. He wasn't good enough. He got benched. He started at Tennessee before Hendon Hooker. He wasn't good enough. He got benched. Does more experience in that Tennessee system help him? Maybe, but we've seen who this guy is for a couple of years now, and I'm skeptical that he's going to radically change who he is when the lights come on now that he's a starter in a Tennessee offense. But mind you, does have to replace some key pieces.
All right, two quick things, and we'll let you go because I know you got a lot going on here today, and we certainly appreciate you being with us. One of these is not important. One of these is more important. Here's the not important thing, and I kind of joked about this before you joined us. Do you agree with me that Ohio State's getting more credit for having played Georgia close than Georgia's getting credit for actually having won the game?
100%, yes. And again, I think that speaks to where Ohio State was last season. Coming off that loss to Michigan, they rallied. Probably should have won that game, but, as much as Georgia found a way to win it, Ohio State found a way to lose that as well. And so, Ohio State seems to be getting a benefit of the doubt here. And I'll point out, for a program that, there have been questions about how tough that team is and how tough that team has been in recent seasons. And you can question the physical toughness against Michigan. I think you can question some of the mental toughness against Georgia. They have to replace 3 starters on that offensive line, including both tackles who are both NFL draft picks. And while, yes, Georgia has to do the same, Georgia has shown that they can recruit and develop at an elite level, and it helps that Amarius Mims is one of those guys stepping in. Ohio State had to go into the transfer portal to look for offensive linemen, and there, quite frankly, aren't a lot of offensive linemen in the transfer portal that are available, and we've talked about that before. So, look, when your quarterback is as important to Ohio State as C.J. Stroud was, and as I think Kyle McCord is going to be, you need to be able to protect him. And if you have major questions against a Michigan front, a Penn State front that's got some players, Georgia potentially, Alabama, whoever, I do have questions about how that team is going to ultimately look when they face an elite defense.
All right, final thing for you, and my guess is you disagree with me based on what you wrote today at DawgNation.com, but I'm going to ask you anyway. I said before you joined us, I believe that Georgia's number one strength this year is its offensive line. I also think that's a pretty good strength to have, and maybe the most important thing to be the best at if you're trying to be as good as Georgia wants to be. So I'm just curious, do you think the offensive line is Georgia's best position group?
No, I would take the inside linebacker position with the caveat. Shimon London misses a lot of time, like he misses into November potentially, then I would probably shift my answer to the offensive line. But for right now, with what we know, as far as we know, I would still take the inside linebacker room because while Cedric Van Pran is going to be the best center in the country, I don't know that he has the kind of impact on an offensive line that, say, a dominant tackle would or another guy. I think with offensive line, you're only as good as your weakest position, and we don't know who Georgia's left tackle is going to be right now. Whereas at inside linebacker, assuming Shimon London is healthy, which is a fairly big assumption at this point, I will admit, you have 2 stars, 2 guys that could legitimately be All-Americans in Jamon Dumas-Johnson and Shimon London. And then behind them, Jalen Walker is as talented as any player on this defense. And look, it's going to sound hyperbolic. I think there's a world where if he develops the right way, he could be the best linebacker that ever played for Kirby Smart or at that inside linebacker position. And so I think that highly of him. And so I think that, just give me those 3 guys. And then obviously you have guys like Davian Story and even younger guys like a C.J. Allen, like a Raylan Wilson. Offensive line is the second answer, and if London is not fully able to go this season and be the player we saw at the end of last year, I would pick the offensive line. But right now, I'm still taking the inside linebacker room. Had
a feeling you might say that, and it's certainly a provocative argument and a really good answer. Connor, we appreciate you stepping in here on short notice in our program here today. We wish you well as you enjoyed some much-deserved vacation time. And obviously, when you get back into town and a few days from now, we'll look forward to reading everything you have coming at DawgNation.com there as well. Enjoy the vacation, and we'll look forward to talking to you soon.
Yep, hope I got on base, BA.
You definitely did, Connor. Appreciate it.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So let me give you a quick follow-up to what Connor talks about right there, which is his belief that the inside linebacker position might be better than the offensive line. As I told you before, I think there are reasonable answers other than offensive line as Georgia's best overall position group. I just made my case for being the offensive line there a moment ago. But the one thing most of us would probably agree with, in most cases, generic football team. Let's don't say Georgia Bulldogs for a moment. Let's say generic football team. What most of us would probably agree is, well, typically speaking, an offensive line is probably more important than an inside linebacker room. And I think that's probably generally speaking probably true. Hey, you'd rather have, if you had your choice of, I can have the best inside linebackers or I can have the best offensive line, most of us would say it's probably generally better to have the better offensive line. If you could have a dominant strength at one spot, you'd probably pick offensive line. But at Georgia, it does seem like, and I'm not an X's and O's expert, don't really pretend to be, never really had to be, it does seem like the inside linebacker position at Georgia has had kind of an outsized value to this program in comparison to other programs, where you don't often see like the inside linebackers just like coveted guys in the first round of drafts and things like that, NFL drafts and things like that. But at Georgia, dominant inside linebacker play has really proven to be a valuable part of the formula for successful teams. Go back to Kirby Smart's first really successful team in 2017. What did you have? You had a Roquan Smith winning the Butkus Award. Well, in 2021, when Georgia won its first national championship, once again, you had a guy like Nakobe Dean winning the Butkus Award. That interior linebacker play for Georgia, I believe, has been really important. Now, listen, college football is one of those things where you want to be good at every position because every position matters. But at Georgia, it does seem like the inside linebacker position, for whatever reason, has had a bigger role in the overall success piece than maybe it has for other teams, where you talk more about edge rusher, you talk more about lockdown cornerback, you talk more about whatever else. At Georgia, that inside linebacker position has really mattered, and a guy like Jamon Dumas-Johnson was an example of that last year. I think Smile Mondon probably played at a level a year ago that was far better than the attention that he probably got, and as Connor kind of points out correctly here, some questions about when exactly Smile returns to full health, for Georgia here this year. Eventually that'll be the case. Maybe not quite, maybe at the very beginning of the season, or at least led to believe as a possibility. But when you think about, inside linebacker might be as good as offensive line. Connor says it's better. Some of you might agree. At a place like Georgia, that's also really mattered and been very important to the overall success piece there as well. Just sort of something to keep in mind. With that said, we'll go cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean, something I love doing here. Always have fun with all of that. And just got back off of a Royal Caribbean cruise ship myself. We were on board Independence of the Seas. And it was one of those things where we wanted that sort of short getaway. For me, it's kind of like my last summer hurrah. One of those things where, hey, we want to get my brother and his family, my mom, my wife, and our kids, and we want to get on board. We'll all have fun together. And it worked out exactly as I hoped that it would. Everybody loved Perfect Day Coco Cay, and I've told you before, when I am searching for a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation, that's the thing that I'm starting with. And it's frankly the reason why when I think cruise vacation, I only think Royal Caribbean, because they're the only ones who have Perfect Day Coco Cay. They're the only ones who have that private island oasis right there in the Bahamas. And so when it was time to sort of talk about our DawgNation cruise for 2024, a lot of folks had a lot of different ideas, but I'm standing up saying, we got to go back to Perfect Day Coco Cay. I just love it. I love everything about it. I love the thrill side. I love the chill side. I probably especially love the chill side because when I'm on vacation, I kind of like to be a little bit of a chill guy, a little bit. Sit in the beach chair, go hang out by the pool, the Oasis Lagoon, enjoy the great buffet style, cookout style lunch. I just love all of that. And you don't get any more perfect than right there in the middle of the Bahamas, this perfect private island that only folks on board a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation get a chance to enjoy. So when we take our DawgNation cruise in 2024, we're going back to Perfect Day Coco Cay. When you take your own Royal Caribbean cruise vacation, I think you ought to go to Perfect Day Coco Cay there as well. So Jessica Slater's a travel agent. She can help you with it. Give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. Make sure you check her out. You can also go to her website, royaldogs.com. That is royaldogs.com. Jessica has done such a great job of putting together a great website to educate you and all the fun stuff happening April of 2024 when the DawgNation cruise returns. So make sure you check all of that out with her. That's going to be a great, great time. All right, let's go cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. I told you a moment ago, it was interesting to see Jaden Daniels, LSU quarterback, has said something kind of provocative. It's kind of an interesting boast, one of those sort of hot takes we sort of have fun with on a show like this. He says that he believes that his quarterback room, not he himself, he didn't say, I'm the best quarterback in the SEC. What he said was he thought that his quarterback room was the best in the SEC. And obviously, on the one hand, we can kind of compare that to what Georgia has because, you're primarily looking at Daniels, the effective starter when healthy. Garrett Nussmeier, a guy that we saw come in the second half of the SEC championship a year ago. You compare that to what Georgia has with Carson Beck, the presumed starter, talented, touted backups like Brock Vandegrift and Gunnar Stockton. A lot of Georgia fans might say, LSU, I'm not quite so sure you guys really are the most talented quarterback room in the SEC, as Jaden Daniels recently said that it was. I think that Georgia might have a strong case for that. A lot of Georgia fans would agree. But ultimately, this for me isn't so much a statement about Georgia as it is a statement about another team in the SEC, and that is Alabama. Because I think Daniels, without meaning to, he's just a player. He's just sort of speaking off the cuff, sort of speaking his mind here on all that. But Daniels, without meaning to, has sort of furthered what I believe is a pretty important narrative that has been in place for most of this offseason. Like, why is it that at one point in time, January, February, it seems like a lot of folks were kind of, really locked in on Alabama as a playoff team, an SEC West winner, maybe even a true competitor to Georgia. And over the course of the last couple of months, it seems like some of that has sort of moved in the direction of LSU. It's almost like you're in kind of like political primary season and people have sort of left one candidate and gone to the other. It seems like a lot of folks have kind of left the Alabama candidacy and sort of flocked towards the LSU candidacy here. Why is that? I think it's for the reason that that Daniel sort of mentions here. As I've said to you many times, I believe that LSU has two quarterbacks better than anything that Alabama has on its roster. And, a lot of the stuff about choosing a quarterback, some of this is just about a numbers game. It's about putting together a competition that involves enough talented players that you hope somebody emerges. And you may not care who that somebody is. You just want it to be somebody. But in the case of Alabama, where you bring in Tyler Buchner from, Notre Dame, who may have been third-string quarterback if he stayed there. Jalen Milroe, who we did see for Alabama a year ago, he was unspectacular when he did play. Ty Simpson was supposed to be the next big thing, the former elite recruit. And oftentimes, it's the absence of evidence that makes a prospect seem more intriguing because you can kind of fill in the gaps in your imagination with how good that he might be. Well, a lot of folks saw Ty Simpson during the spring, and they were unimpressed. And so you've got Milroe, Simpson, and now going to be soon Buchner. And the thought is, well, Alabama may be sort of scuffling its way through a preseason practice period, trying to find who its starting quarterback is going to be. If Garrett Nussmeier, the LSU backup, was on the Alabama roster, he'd be the clear, unquestioned starter, I believe. If Jaden Daniels was on the Alabama roster right now, he'd be the clear, unquestioned starter, and LSU would still have more than a capable performer in its own right with Nussmeier as its own starter. That right now LSU just has a deeper quarterback situation than Alabama, and that's why everybody seemingly other than Kirk Herbstreit, who's just obsessed with the past, that is seemingly why there has been a little bit of migration lately towards LSU is not just a team that could win the SEC West, but as I told you last week, a team that could join Georgia as one of two SEC teams in this year's college football playoff. I think that Jaden Daniels sort of says that the right way. Pretty interesting quote from him. Quick recruiting update, a guy we've talked about before, Carter Nelson from the state of Nebraska. Plays sort of a weird version of, I guess, 8-man football out there. Kind of a sort of do-everything type guy out there. Well, Nelson decided to stay in his home state. Nelson did commit to Nebraska. So want to maybe give you that update. Jeff Sentell talked glowingly of Nelson about the kind of playmaker he thought he could be. There's a little bit of an interesting translation there as you kind of move from a very, very low level of high school football to a much higher level of college football. But Jeff was of the belief that Nelson was a big-time athlete and a guy who had a chance to do some pretty special things at Georgia. But instead, he is going to be a part of Matt Rule's team there at Nebraska. Now, I'll just say this real quick. We don't talk Nebraska football here very much, but I do think Rule's presence here is kind of interesting. I mean, I think the one thing that kind of drove Rule to the NFL from Baylor was I don't think that Matt Rule is like all that into the whole recruiting part and the kind of tough grind that is required to be a college football coach, the sort of 12-month grind of all of that. As of now, Rule's not welcome in the NFL. He got fired as the Carolina Panthers coach, so he had to have a job, so he goes back to Nebraska. But I do think that Rule could be coming back to college at a pretty interesting time. And we talked, we have talked before about these sort of big fan bases and how, sometimes big fan bases can kind of propel your NIL situation. I'm led to believe that Nebraska probably is a little bit of an underrated player in the NIL situation. I have no idea how much Carter Nelson might have gotten for going to Nebraska. I won't even pretend to know that. I'm not saying this was an NIL thing, but when you see Nebraska win a recruiting battle here, I think it could be a little bit of a reminder that with Rule in place, with the NIL stuff potentially aiding his recruiting efforts, something I don't think he very much enjoyed doing there at Baylor, we could see Nebraska be a little bit more of a factor in some recruiting battles moving forward. They won't often be in-state type battles. There's just not a lot of good high school football being played in Nebraska. But, go back to the 90s, Nebraska was one of the powers. Maybe for a while they were the power in all of college football. And this has been a heritage program for many, many decades. Hard to remember that because they've been, sort of mediocre or less the last few years. But Rule's going to have a chance to change some of that a bit. In an expanded Big Ten where everybody's sort of fighting for their seat at the table, I think Nebraska could do some more fighting in that regard in the future. So keep that in mind on the heels of winning the battle for Connor Nelson right there. And then I'll also mention this. Nice to see record viewership for the College World Series finale between LSU and Florida. There had been some chatter about, what if there's two SEC teams or whatever else. But in this particular case, the College World Series overall, pretty big-time viewership here. On the heels of a softball situation where you had big-time viewership for that, record viewership for the women's Final Four there as well. I think a lot of folks kind of finding out something that a lot of us have known for a long time, that college athletics is just really, really fun. And most of these, College World Series, final games involving LSU and Florida, these are drawing higher ratings than any regular season Major League Baseball game here this year on the national network there, ESPN. It just sort of goes to show you that for all that people want to, I don't know, there's a lot of concerns about the future of college athletics. I certainly get that. We've probably expressed some of our own concerns there as well. But in terms of the way in which fans and viewers are responding to this product, not just football, but across all sports, it seems like college athletics are in a pretty good spot here right now. So good to see a sport that I love, college baseball, getting some much-deserved attention and big-time eyeballs, ratings-wise, on ESPN there. So that's worth touting there a little bit, too. And we will make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And for our golden shoe today, we'll keep the cruise theme going here. One of our great commenters, you see him on our YouTube side, and he's obviously always active on Twitter, stirring things up. It's our buddy Frankie Fibonacci, and he spoke my own language here with a message that he sent to me. We talk a lot about, the next sort of wave of, no pun intended, of Royal Caribbean cruising. The debut of Icon of the Seas coming up. Frankie shared with me that Icon of the Seas, the biggest cruise ship ever, has completed its construction. So Icon of the Seas set to sail next year. Frankie sharing that with me. You love to see that. And how good does that look there, the rendering of Icon of the Seas? It's going to be an amazing experience, unlike anything that's ever really happened before. What a fun thing that's going to be, and I appreciate Frankie sharing that. Golden shoe coming his way for letting us know about all of that. How about our Gator Hater countdown? Dogs in Jacksonville, 121 days from now, beating Florida again. That's a fun thought to consider. And we'll talk to you tomorrow, DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether and Tharp. And on video, time for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them on all of that. All right, we have done right by you all over the last couple of days. Very long comment sections. We are not going to go quite as long today for a number of reasons. One of those being just for a number of reasons. So let me pop in here. We'll get some comments. We'll kind of roll through, and then we'll get ready to see y'all on a Friday to close out a week. By the way, for next week, we are live on Monday, just like always. Tuesday's the 4th of July, so we're going to honor our nation's birthday by enjoying that particular holiday, and then back again on Wednesday after that. So no show coming up on Tuesday. And y'all try to remind me to make sure I say that to the live audience tomorrow there as well. All right, here we go on Facebook. Let's see what else. Yeah, Connor. Connor, not the world's greatest signal today. I will certainly acknowledge that. We try to keep that a little bit short. Connor also kind enough to sort of jump in on short notice. We can't give him too hard of a time about that. But it was not the world's greatest signal. You are right about that. Johnny Prescott says, I saw a preseason poll yesterday that had the lousy stinking Gators in the top 20. He says, I suppose that helps our strength of schedule that it actually occurs. Yeah, so I saw where Florida was in the ESPN FPI in the top 20. That's one of those analytical sort of math type things. And it is a reminder that, these people, while we may not always love all that data stuff, these people aren't just making this stuff up from whole cloth. So it does give Florida maybe a chance, a consideration of winning more games than most of us sort of think they're going to. It's worth considering. But you're also going to touch on something I think it's also a fair point there as well, which is that if you want – there are multiple ways to sort of measure strength of schedule. And if you want to measure it from something like the ESPN FPI type thing, which is probably actually the overall best way to do it, the Georgia schedule at that point in time looks a little tougher. Kaylee Manziel also asks a good question, too. She says, if Michigan was in the SEC West, what would his record be? I think they'd lose at least twice, right? I mean, I think they would have a very good chance of losing to Alabama, very good chance of losing to LSU. Some of the reasons why we think some of these teams outside the SEC are elite is because they don't play SEC teams more frequently than they do. Now, if you said, if my life depended on it, who is more likely to beat Michigan, LSU, or Alabama? I want to take LSU there on that point. It's not obvious to me that Alabama will be better than Michigan. Some of that may depend on where the game is played. But, the idea that Michigan – I guess the question you would ask yourself is, well, if Georgia's absolutely dragging Michigan, 2 years ago, what's changed in the last 2 years to make it seem like that game being closer right now? Well, Michigan's gotten better. Well, has Georgia gotten worse? I think those are fair questions. Let's see what else. Bill Sanders asked if I'm going on another cruise for the 4th of July. No, I don't have any more cruises scheduled anytime soon. I got to get serious about the season. July is our time to do that. We're game face on now. Scott Gentry says, who do you see as the top 3 running backs this year? I guess I'd go Kendall, Dejon, and Branson Robinson. Those would be my top 3. Kendall would be my leading rusher. A lot of folks would say, well, Branson Robinson's ready to eclipse maybe Dejon Edwards to come into the top 2, and maybe that could be the case. We've also seen at Georgia last couple of years that veteran presence at the running back spot has really mattered. It has. And so no disrespect to Rod Robinson, who we did see on G-Day. It's a big, strong guy. And obviously Andrew Paul, who a lot of folks are excited about. But keep in mind, there was a time back during spring practice where Kirby Smart said of Andrew Paul that he was about in his recovery at the same stage that Nick Chubb would have been at that point in 2016, coming off his big-time injury in 2015. And while Chubb was a player in 2016, he gained 1,000 yards for Georgia, he was nowhere near the same player in 2016 that I believe that he was in 2017. So if you want to kind of use the same analogy there, that you may see Andrew Paul playing, and you may see some flashes from Andrew Paul, but the very best of Andrew Paul might not come until 2024. If I had to guess, that's how I might interpret that. Oren Sheely says, if Arian Smith stays healthy, what numbers do you see? So, Oren, I think that's a very good question. This is where I have to be a little bit self-aware. This time of year, one of the things that we've always loved doing in this comment section, because we've been doing this part of the show, the sort of live interaction part. We've been doing this for a good number of years now, spanning multiple studios and things like that. We've just been doing this for a long time. And this time of year, it always seems like we have a good time betting the over on everybody. Oh, this guy's going to do this. This guy's going to do that. 1,000 yards here, 1,000 yards there, 1,000 yards there. That's just the sort of the nature of the sports conversation this time of year. Betting the over, hope springs eternal, individual accolades coming the way of a lot of different players. That's just sort of, what we do. So I realize that that's kind of the backdrop for this. But to Oren's specific point about Arian Smith, there is a chance that Arian Smith is very, very, very good. And there's a chance that we just haven't seen it yet because he's been hurt as much as he is. But how good was he against Ohio State? Now, I realize that all Georgia did was win that game, and unlike the courageous, heroic effort of Ohio State, who found a way to keep it close, I realize that Georgia can't quite claim the same glory from that game that Ohio State can, despite the fact that Georgia won it. But, y'all, how good was Arian against Ohio State? He left spring practice healthy, and it seems like he's healthy to begin this year. This is also a guy who was like a top 10 wide receiver nationally. I'm not so sure Georgia's ever going to sign the 5-star wide receiver, but Arian Smith is about as close as you can get to being that without actually being that. If Georgia does have like that massive, huge breakout player this year, somebody who just kind of goes from like unknown to well-known, Arian's about as good a guess on that as anybody. Alan Bonchik's got it, says a healthy Arian Smith's going to have a 2,000-yard season. See, that's what we do this time of year. That's what we do. And Alan's absolutely playing along exactly right. But in the case of Arian Smith, like he really could be really, really, really very good. There's a certain thing of most of the stuff that we talk about here is a somewhat educated guess. For instance, take Dominic Lovett for a moment. Okay, there's a proof of concept for Lovett. Last year, playing on a team that didn't have a lot going for it, Lovett had 900 yards receiving, almost 900 yards receiving. So you come here to Georgia. Now you say, well, you start with that as the baseline, and maybe it's slightly less than that at Georgia because there's so many other guys to throw the ball to. But maybe it's also one of those things with Darnell Washington not being here anymore. Maybe Georgia wants that slot receiver in the game a little bit more, and maybe Georgia wants to feed, Lovett a little bit more. But you can make a statement about Lovett that's a somewhat educated guess. The same thing for a guy like Ladd McConkey. Okay, well, McConkey was doing this a year ago. He had almost 800 yards receiving. Therefore, this year, based on sort of proof of concept, you can make somewhat of an educated guess about what he might be. Brock Bowers, very easy to do. Look at the 2 years of dominance. I think you can sort of pencil him in for another dominant year. Obviously, hopefully he stays healthy, able to do that. But if he does, easy to pencil him in for a dominant year. Those are educated guesses, very easy to make. Well, sometimes we're wrong, but you have some evidence in your favor in order to make whatever argument you want to make. In the case of Arian Smith, we don't quite have the same substantial evidence. We have to use our imagination a little bit, and because of the speed, because of the fact that Tennessee game big catch, Ohio State game big catch, because of the fact that you close your eyes, you have this vision of him just running past the defense. Boy, it's easy for that imagination, that mind to just wander. It's easy for all that to kind of really kind of bubble up to the surface, and it could get very, very fun thinking about what he might be able to do. Let's see what else. Joseph Kennedy says Ohio State's never going to give us credit for beating us. Frankly, we don't need it. Yeah, I mean, listen, I don't expect the Buckeyes to do anything. I don't expect their fans to do anything. But it'd be nice if somebody ever occasionally acknowledged Georgia actually did win the game. As I said before, before the Ohio State game, the one thing we're told about Georgia is, can they win the shootout? Well, they proved they could win the shootout, but it seems like the goalpost has been moved again. And I'm not one of these thin-skinned fans. I'm really not. People are always trying to troll me and come after me on social media, things like that. I don't really respond to any of it. It doesn't really do much for me. I'm not one of these guys that has real thin skin about myself, about the team, about anything else. I'm just really not. But that is illogical nonsense. And we're going to point out the fact that what people were saying prior to a game like that, and what they said after a game like that, were not the same thing. We're going to point that out. Marshall Colbert says, I think Arian Smith can easily get to 1,000 yards. Nobody can guard him. He's so fast. Yeah. That is the thing, Marshall. He has that elite trait. He's got that blazing speed, and that is as valuable as it gets. You're right about that. All right, I'm going to go to YouTube, and then tomorrow we'll try to do a longer run of comments to kind of close out the week. Jonathan Aaron says if UGA is getting hate because we beat Ohio State, Michigan beat Ohio State, so they would beat us. What happened with Michigan and TCU? Yeah, that's the thing. Is there's just sort of a lack of logic sort of in play there. It's not, and a lot of this, as one of our commenters pointed out a little earlier, a lot of this is sort of driven by people want something other than Georgia to talk about, not because they're anti-Georgia, just because they're anti-repetition. Georgia's won the last two. I think the media would beg for somebody else other than Georgia to be the team, and it's always good business to tout a team like Michigan. That's just the way it is. We had Connor point that out. It's absolutely 100% true. But the reason why shows like this exist, see, there was a time, you want to go back 10, 15, 20 years ago, ESPN controlled it all. The college football conversation was controlled solely by ESPN. ESPN decided what college football was, and college football was whatever ESPN said that it was. That's why people hung on the words of guys like Lee Corso and Kirk Herbstreit, the old days of Mark May and Lou Holtz and those guys. You don't go back 20 years ago, people were watching TV hanging on their words because college football was whatever ESPN said that it was. Go back to 2007 for a moment. Remember that great night, final regular season night in 2007 when West Virginia lost and all these things happened where it seemed like Georgia had moved into the BCS top two and Georgia was going to play the national championship. And Mark Richt goes on ESPN that night on SportsCenter. And a lot of us back in 2007, we thought, man, this night has worked out perfectly. Georgia's going to play for the national championship. And then ESPN came on TV later on that night and the narrative went out that Georgia shouldn't play for the national championship because they didn't win their division. Remember that? Do you remember when this happened? And at that point in time, boom, it changed. Just like that. It changed. Georgia was told by ESPN, because back then the BCS was determined by the polls. The formula had some computer stuff in it, but that was just for show. 2/3 of the formula for the BCS was the AP poll and the coaches poll, and ESPN was dictating the tenets of the conversation that night in 2007. And the clarion call went out that Georgia should not play for the BCS title because Georgia did not win its division. And that's exactly what happened. Georgia got left out in 2007 because back then college football was whatever ESPN said that it was. That's not the way things are anymore. We've been doing this show since 2015, and shows like this exist to sort of reflect a level of opinion that sometimes ESPN doesn't quite share. We talk college football every day. When ESPN's fixated on NBA offseason, we're talking college football around here. And we're also providing a perspective that sometimes ESPN's either incapable of providing or unwilling to provide. And that's just the way that things are these days. Things have changed in the media landscape. Paul Moon says, I was so mad about that in 2007. And then see, Paul brings up a good point. He says, okay, back in 2007, Georgia wasn't eligible for the national championship in ESPN's mind because it didn't win its division. But 2011, you've got LSU and Alabama playing for the national championship, despite the fact that in that case, Alabama had not won its division. Something we were told that really mattered in 2007. By 2011, doesn't matter anymore. ESPN had just changed its mind. Reserved the right to do that because college football was whatever ESPN said that it was. You do not hold on to monopolies like that forever. You do not. You don't get to have that kind of stranglehold, that kind of total control forever. You just don't. Eventually, someone's going to rise up and take it from you. And the internet sort of rised up. The internet, collectively speaking, said we can do college football better than this. And some of that was like written stuff, and some of that was shows like what we do, and now there's even more people who kind of do something kind of like what we have done for a long time. But the internet said, we don't think ESPN's doing college football well enough. They may own it, but they're not doing it as well as it can be done, and we feel like we can do it better. And now college football media is mostly an internet thing. ESPN's piece of the college football media pie, even though the ones that telecast the large number of the games, the actual sort of 12-month day-to-day college football conversation, the ESPN sliver of that gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller because people said, hey, there's a college football audience that's not being served very well by the monopolistic owner of the sport, and we think we can do it better, and we've proven we can. Army Dog Charlie says it's time for someone to topple ESPN for good. We will certainly see how that plays out in future years. We will. I think it'll be a very interesting thing to watch. Nature Gator says that in 2009, Florida would have played Bama again in the playoffs under the 4-team playoff of today. Is that true? It may be. That's the year that Alabama played Texas. Is that right? Could very well have been true because Florida didn't lose to anybody else. That was a good Florida team. That could very well have been true. Let's see what else. Frederick Meriwether says it's going to be a really, really tall order trying to get a game off of Georgia for the next 3 to 5 years at least. There's a chance that Frederick's right about that. Now, college football is also very hard. It's hard to win, hard to predict. Weird things are going to happen. The thing I pointed out over and over again is when Alabama was sitting in this position back in 2011 and 2012 and 2013, a first-year coach, Gus Malzahn, glorified high school coach, using a former defensive back at quarterback, they, had the Jordan Hare, the kick six, and all of a sudden they're the SEC champions. That came completely out of nowhere. So something weird could happen this year. It certainly could. But there's also a chance that conventional wisdom just holds, and, there is very little reason to think that Georgia won't be as good as it is right now for the next several years to come, if not eventually getting better. Frederick's point is certainly a fair one there on that. Let me go to DawgNation.com for a moment, and then we're going to wrap it up for today. Doggy also points out, this is on DawgNation.com, this is a really good point, So Bruce Feldman's argument in favor of Michigan is the common opponent, Ohio State. This is such a good point. I wish I'd have said this. I may steal this point and claim it as my own. So Doggy says that Bruce Feldman used the common opponent, Ohio State. Georgia barely beat Ohio State. They'd win the game. You would think that matters, but apparently it doesn't. That Georgia beat Ohio State close, but Michigan beat them bad. And that somehow proved that Michigan's better than Ohio. That somehow proves that Michigan's ready for Georgia. But Feldman just completely ignores the TCU thing. Michigan lost to TCU, and Georgia beat TCU so bad that it considered giving up the sport. Georgia's national championship win, as I said the other day, that is college football's version of Secretariat at the Belmont. Now, I've given you a lot of 90s references, Jordan, Tiger. Now I'm giving you a 70s reference. Maybe my references are getting too dated. I think Connor was politely trying to say that earlier in our conversation. But if you've ever seen the picture of Secretariat, like way out in front, just gap between it and the other horses, whoever the other horses were. Like college ball's version of Secretariat at the Belmont was Georgia against TCU. Funny that Bruce Feldman, at least in the quote we read to you earlier, did not seem to mention that common opponent. That's very, very fair. Very, very fair. I think that's a really good point, Doggy. Let's see what else. DT, yeah, no, listen, I'm very grateful, for all the folks who always step in here and make DawgNation Daily a fun thing every day. Very, very grateful for all of that. All right, so we are going to get ready to roll out of here. And tomorrow we'll do more comments, I promise. We're going to bounce out of here for today. So hope all of you have a great day. Thanks for being a part of this. Y'all check out our friends at RS Andrews. They're online at rsandrews.com. No joke. The heat index this weekend's like 175 or something like that. I mean, it's just going to be through the roof. That means your air conditioning is going to be just grinding. And if you got one of those old ACs, some of y'all got these AC units 30 years old. Like you deep down know that thing, it's going to be hard for it to make its way through the hot summer. Like the real hot part of the summer just now beginning. Well, our friends at RS Andrews can give you the peace of mind that you need to know, hey, I'm tuned up to factory fresh spec. I'm cool. I'm comfortable. Because listen, I'm a bigger guy, especially post-cruise. I'm probably even a little bigger than normal. I need AC. Us big guys, we got to have that AC. My big fat cheeks, I want to feel that cold air just blowing right there on my face. That's why I need my air conditioning unit to stay tuned up and ready to go, and RS Andrews can do all of that for all of us. So find them online at rsandrews.com. But it's not just the AC stuff. You got the plumbing issue, the electrical issue. Don't let your weekend get ruined, especially this weekend. It's the 4th of July, for goodness sakes. It's our nation's birthday. Don't be stuck trying to figure out a water heater situation. Get that thing replaced same day if needed. rsandrews.com. All right, so we'll have a fun conclusion of the week tomorrow, and we will look forward to seeing you then. It is DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether and Tharp. We'll talk to you then, everybody.